Thanks again. Okay, our last speaker, we have George Kimbrell here from the Center for Food Safety. I'm going to hold the mic. Do you want me to put it on a stand? I think it's easier that way. Welcome, welcome.
Hello, good morning. I'm George Kimbrell with the Center for Food Safety. I came from the other Portland, Oregon, to be here. First, I want to say thank you to Downey Salmon Federation and to Greenhorns for having me and for putting this together. And I'm excited to learn on the ground here from all of you about the good work that's being done that I've heard about that's been very inspiring. I want to click to the next one. I am the legal director and co-executive director of a nationwide nonprofit that is a sustainable regenerative agriculture nonprofit. We work on everything farm to fork in the food system on behalf of farmers to protect the environment and to give consumers the right to know what they eat and feed their families. Next slide. We have over 1 million members across the country, over 5,000 here in Maine. It's free to be a member, and those are all of our different program areas. Obviously here today I'm here to talk about industrial aquaculture, and we do signify it by saying industrial to separate it from other forms of sustainable, small-scale aquaculture. But it is a flagship program that we've had for over our 25-year history at Center for Food Safety. Next slide, please. Yeah, I've been doing this work as a public interest environmental lawyer for over 2 decades now, and our program, like I said, is over 25 years old, working on science, policy, and law on this issue of aquaculture. I was remembering and putting these slides together, our first report, The Catch on Seafood, is from 2004, which kind of documented some of the myriad environmental, socioeconomic, and health impacts from industrial aquaculture that you heard the last speaker speak so well about. Our work has run the gamut on this, and I'm going to focus on some of our public interest litigation, but just to give you a scope, we've worked in coalition in Washington, D.C. for several decades to prevent the licensing of industrial aquaculture in the federal waters. So here what we're dealing with is state waters from 3 to 0 miles out, but there's also what's called the exclusive economic zone, which is 3 to 200 miles out, which is U.S. federally controlled waters, where they have also tried to put proponents of aquaculture net pens and cages for a couple decades. We've worked, you heard about what happened in Washington. I'll talk a little bit about that. I do think campaign work and all the tools of the social change toolkit are important, but one of the things that we pride ourselves on is our public interest litigation, and that was part of the Washington story, as it is in many of these instances of uprooting or halting industrial agriculture or industrial aquaculture, as we'll talk about today. And yeah, we elevate and amplify the voices of local communities. Our lawyering is is pro bono. We don't charge our clients, and we don't seek damages. We seek equitable relief, like injunctive relief, stopping harm from happening on the ground to communities. I want to clarify that because lawyers have a bad rep, and rightfully so, right? Not one of those. Next slide, please. All right, so these are the cases I'm going to talk through. My slides are pretty busy. I'm also moonlight as a law professor, so you'll probably catch a little bit of that here. And if you have questions at the end, acronyms or otherwise, I'm happy to run through any of it. And again, I'm going to talk through all these. But the first case was a case we litigated in the Gulf of Mexico in New Orleans on behalf of fisheries groups down there, successfully stopping what would have been the first ever aquaculture in federal waters in the Gulf of Mexico. The next case listed on behalf of local groups around the country, especially in the Pacific Northwest, would have allowed for the construction permits of aquaculture operations off the Pacific coast for the first time. I'm going to talk a little bit. You might know about this one, the genetically engineered salmon story. Anybody know about this? This was the first ever genetically engineered food animal that they were going to grow in Prince Edward Island, an on-land facility, and then truck it down here to the United States to sell. We represented some local Maine groups in that case. I'll talk about that. The net pen prohibition in Washington that we just was mentioned by the prior speakers, and some industrial shellfish aquaculture also on the Pacific coast where I'm based. Next slide. So the Gulf case essentially came out of the fact that the U.S. government has been trying to put industrial aquaculture in our federal waters for a couple decades, as I mentioned. They couldn't get a law passed in Congress that gave them this authority, since this is a new, novel industrial activity, unlike fishing, right, fish farming. And so instead, the Department of Commerce tried to use their fishing authority, the Magnuson-Stevens Act, if you know what that is, to site these facilities in the Gulf of Mexico. It would have been 10-year permits, and it would have allowed them to grow up to 64 million pounds annually. That's more than the annual catch of all the wild fish in the Gulf except shrimp and menhaden. It would have privatized these big swaths of the Gulf of Mexico, right, for just aquaculture use, kind of taking what was a public commons, the traditional fishing ground areas, and allowing them to be roped off for these net pens or the cages. And this was their test case at the Department of Commerce and the National Marine Fisheries Service, as the federal agency wanted to do this in all of the federal waters of the United States. So after the administrative process there in 2016, we started the case. Next slide. Importantly, like I said, in that case, our lead clients were local recreational and fishing charter boat operations there in the Gulf of Mexico. Alabama Charters Fishers Association, the Destin Charter Boat Association, the Charter Fishermen's Association, Clearwater Marine Association. We had probably 24 clients, but those were some of them. And we successfully convinced first the federal district court in Louisiana and then the Fifth Circuit Court of Appeals that the Magnuson-Stevens Act did not provide the federal government the congressional authority to license, for the first time ever, industrial aquaculture facilities in the federal waters of the United States. And so that rulemaking, that programmatic rulemaking, was thrown out. It was vacated, made null and void. And as a result of that, we don't have this industry in the federal waters of the Gulf of Mexico. So that's the square mileage of the Gulf of Mexico. That was about 10 years ago when that was proposed. So now, absent this public interest litigation and decision, we would have that industry like in our federal waters. So I think a very important legal precedent, but also for the practical impact on the ground. And again, elevating the voices, letting the court understand that there were conservation interests involved, but also fishery interests involved, opposed to this, because of what we've seen internationally, right? You just heard from the last speakers, while in the U.S., industrial aquaculture has yet to really take a major foothold. There are places like Washington and Maine where the battle is being on. Globally, we have several decades of experience of separating the hype from the reality of these facilities and the harm that they bring to both the local economy as well as the local environment. And so we were able to present that to the court in the case. One quick anecdote is that as a 3-judge panel in a court of appeals in New Orleans, not exactly the most environmentally friendly federal court if you know anything about the Fifth Circuit. So when I got up to speak to the microphone, one of the 3 judges looked right at me and he said, "Now, you represent the fishermen, right?" And I said, "Yes, Your Honor, I represent the fishermen." And he sat back and folded his arms, and I thought, okay, I got that guy. Just focus on the other 2 now. And we did. We won that appeal. So that's the Gulf fishermen's case. I think a very important aquaculture public interest litigation. Next slide, please. There have been further attempts to build on this, including these executive orders you might have heard of from the federal government in the last 5 years. Importantly, executive orders create no new law, so there are a lot of, sound and fury signifying nothing in terms of what they can do. So absent a new law in Congress, I think we won't have federally licensed aquaculture, although the government continues to try through these executive orders. Next slide, please. The nationwide permit litigation, which just finished last year, was the second effort to do this. So after Magnuson, the government said, okay, we'll try to put aquaculture facilities in the federal waters using an even older law. Instead of the Magnuson-Stevens Act, which is from the 1960s, we're going to use a law from 1898, the Rivers and Harbors Act, to try to put them in federal waters through construction permits under Section 10. So that decision came down in 2022, and we went to court. That would have authorized for the first time these structures, again, in the exclusive economic zone off the coast of the United States. In that case, again, we represented both conservation groups as well as fishery groups, Don't Cage Our Oceans, which you might have heard of, which is a similar umbrella group that work on aquaculture issues, but also groups like the Pacific Coast Federation of Fishermen, the Quinault Nation, one of our local sovereign nations in Washington State, and several other fisheries groups like the Wild Fish Conservancy in Washington State. And in 2025 and 2024, in 2 decisions, the federal courts agreed with us again, saying that the federal government in doing this didn't have the authority to do it and hadn't adequately analyzed the impacts under various core environmental laws to the environment where these structures would have been built and struck down that permit. So again, a second effort there was thwarted to put those facilities in federal waters. Next slide. All right, so the genetically engineered salmon one I wanted to include, it's a little different, right? Someone in the back asked a good question about land-based systems. So you might have heard of this one, as I mentioned at the outset. It was going to be the first ever genetically engineered food that's an animal. You know, we have crop systems, we don't have food, and it was a salmon that was engineered with deep water ocean pout genes, allegedly to grow 4 times as fast as a regular salmon. And it was pretty controversial. It took at least 10 years in Washington, D.C. of major hearings and proposals, that we participated in. There was a lot of campaign work that was very important around it, coalition-based, hundreds of groups, hundreds of thousands of public comments, very controversial decision that it was finally approved in 2015. It was kind of a half Michael Crichton, Kurt Vonnegut type scheme that they used to approve it. They said, we're going to grow the eggs on Prince Edward Island, then we're going to fly them to this kind of facility in Panama to grow them out, and then we're going to refrigerate, truck them back to the United States markets. Really, it was kind of a smokescreen to get the regulatory door open to crack to this particular type of salmon farming. Someone asked earlier in the back a good question about land-based farming and their risks, and I think the answer was good, but what I would add to it is that it has not been shown to be economically viable, right? This is not how we grow salmon globally over decades. A lot of, again, hype different from the promises. The way that it's been able to be economically viable is in net pens and cages in the ocean and all the risks that go along with that, all the harms that go along with that. So the idea that you could grow a genetically engineered salmon or regular salmon, any kind of salmon in, I think, tanks on shore recirculating, and the costs inherent to that have not been shown to be viable at a market scale, to this point at least. Anyway, we challenged this case on environmental risk grounds. Some of our clients are, you may know, Kennebec Reborn, Friends of Merrymeeting Bay here in Maine, because obviously there were tremendous risks to the protected under the Endangered Species Act Atlantic salmon distinct population segments here in Maine, as well as those in Canada, from any escapes. Even though these genetically engineered salmon were, on a hill on Prince Edward Island, there was still a lot of outflow to the water. There was still risks from these facilities, not the same as net pens, but not nil either. And the court said that the federal government, in approving this salmon, didn't adequately assess those risks to endangered salmon here in the Gulf of Maine, under the National Environmental Policy Act, under the Endangered Species Act, under the Administrative Procedures Act, and declared that approval unlawful. And I think in a telling end to the story, in 2024, AquaBounty, the company that was making the genetically engineered salmon, went bankrupt and shut down its operations. So because of this case and the campaign surrounding it, the awareness around it, we do not have a genetically engineered salmon on our plates, in our restaurants, or in our oceans. Again, I think a massive victory in terms of the future for our salmon as well as our food. Next slide, please. The Washington State net pen did come out of a collapse of Cook there in 2017, where they dumped 250,000 salmon into Puget Sound. It did raise awareness, so that helped with the campaign. There was a tremendously successful campaign coalition. I mean, this is a repeated refrain: conservation, fishing, tribal interests, to get Washington State to then pass legislatively a prohibition on first non-native farming and then on all commercial fin fish net pens in 2022. But it also took public interest litigation. The industry challenged the rulemaking in 2025, February. We intervened in that case along with Wild Fish Conservancy in May 2025. And just last month, I'm happy to say that we succeeded in that case, and the Washington ban is now safe. The industry has dropped their legal challenge to it. So again, all the tools in the toolkit working together there, including public interest litigation on behalf of local groups. Next slide, please. We've also done some work. Shellfish aquaculture, I think, is different. It can be, I think, environmentally friendly. It really depends on the scale. Out in Washington State, it's a huge industry that takes over a tremendous amount of the Washington State coast. in terms of the monoculture of the coastal ecosystems. So we've also done some litigation around that in terms of both its environmental impacts as well as its kind of socioeconomic impacts there and navigability of the coastal ecosystems. And this particular case challenged a nationwide permit for shellfish aquaculture, nationwide permit 48, and held that the federal government, this time the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers, failed to consider the impacts to the environment directly and cumulatively. Next slide. And we have a second case. Like oftentimes, this work is 2 steps forward, 1 step back, and generational in terms of progress. So this is just on May 19th. So what is that? 2 weeks ago. That's me and some of our other team and some of our clients in federal court in Tacoma, Washington. The Corps of Engineers instead this time reapproved through, quote, letters of permission, these individual approvers to these shellfish farms on Washington, instead of a general permit to try to get around the last case. So we're back, but they did it without public notice and comment and without really any further environmental assessment or addressing the illegalities that the court noted in the prior decision. So we're now waiting to get the decision in that case, but we're pretty confident we're going to win that case. Next slide. I think another thing to be aware of is what's going on out in the Hawaiian Islands, the Pacific Islands region. This is also kind of another effort to put industrial aquaculture in federal waters, this time out around Hawaii. And again, despite the Gulf fishermen's case I mentioned before, the Department of Commerce is trying to authorize this program using its authority over, quote, fishing to site for the first time aquaculture facilities out there. We don't have a final decision, but we expect it in the next year or so, or even sooner. Could come any day now. So the fight goes on, I guess, is the moral of the story there. Next slide. But I mean, I would say that we've been, you just heard me rattle off 5 different or 4 to 5 different successes that we've had. So it's taken 20 years, I think, over time in all these different ways. But aquaculture is, I think, an importantly tremendous duty and opportunity for all of us that care about our food more broadly. And, I work a lot on industrial agriculture, on confined animal feeding operations, for example, on monocultures, on pesticides, and the impacts of that to our food system. And I see a lot of echoes with aquaculture to agriculture and the fight that we've had for decades. The difference is those CAFOs in Iowa are already entrenched, and it's much harder once something becomes entrenched than it is before it gets entrenched as an industry. So, but I think we can take a lot of lessons, not just from the aquaculture examples that I gave, but also from industrial agriculture. Just like with industrial agriculture, there's a huge difference between the hype with aquaculture and the reality of it, right? And trying to separate the industry propaganda and hype about it from what the actual reality of it is important, right? My colleagues before me gave you some of the details of the adverse impacts of aquaculture. We've seen that the same way with our industrial agriculture system. Privatization of formerly public goods. I mean, we can't save our seeds anymore, right? Is it going to be fish next? Are we going to rope off big portions of the ocean from traditional fishing grounds? That to me is really a similar thing, the corporatization and privatization that we've seen and we want to avoid and learn from with aquaculture. Anytime you have a new food technology over and over and over again, we've seen there's this massive difference between it's not a panacea, first of all, and second of all, it causes new and different and unforeseen, or maybe foreseen, but new problems to be sure. So socioeconomically as well as environmentally. And we see that with aquaculture. Instead of solving the problems it claims to be solving, it's causing more of them. We don't have new laws to address these modern challenges, right? We're trying to squeeze blood from statutory stones to address them. 21st century food system problems, whether that's dealing with pesticides or it's dealing with aquaculture, it's very similar. So a lot of my job is trying to use these core environmental laws that we passed 50, 60 years ago now to address them. But I think passing laws at levels where we can, here in Maine, where you have home rule at the county level, or at the state level, where you have political power to be able to do that, I think is incredibly important. and ideally in Washington, D.C., but we all know the reality in Washington, D.C., right, of getting anything passed. Mostly it's trying to stop bad things from getting passed. Giving people a choice, having meaningful labeling, right? I think they're again, educating consumers on making them know they have the right to know how they eat, what they feed their families, what the labeling is for wild salmon versus farmed salmon, what the ingredients are, how something is produced. People care about that more and more. I think as a nonpartisan issue, they want to know what the production process is of the food is. And like I said, the needed role of public interest litigation as a way of elevating voices, and speaking truth to power, and coming and helping local groups to do that, and that we all need to work together, as I think we've heard, conservation groups, tribal groups, animal welfare groups. You saw some of the videos of the fish in the cages, in the net pens, consumer health groups. And traditional, in this instance, fishing, but whatever industry it is, that are trying to continue their way of life. So it's our choice, I think, as Americans and as our community. Are we going to double down on industrial agriculture and what we've seen for the last 50 years, or are we going to choose a new future for our food with regards to aquaculture and say no? Next slide. All right, that's it from me. You can find out more. It's free to join our organization. We have a lot of information on our website, centerforfoodsafety.org rather. And yeah, happy to answer any questions. Yes.
What about Mara?
Yeah, Mara's. Like I said, you got to keep the bad stuff out, right? It's been introduced over and over again in D.C. Successfully. I think Don't Cage Our Ocean, so I mentioned, has now formalized what used to be kind of a loose coalition for a couple decades before that of conservation and fishing groups fighting bills like Mara, and we'll need to continue to do that. If there is a federal law that allows aquaculture, it would apply to a lot of the federal waters that I just talked about.
Can you say what Mara is? For those who don't know?
Marine Aquaculture Research Act. It's part of this push to put aquaculture in federal waters.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yes.
You made a comment that the feds actually desire to put commercial fishing net operations in federal waters. What's behind that desire? Why would the feds want to do that?
Yeah, I think it's the idea that there is an economic driver to the industry, that we want to create American industry versus
From a lobbying standpoint.
Yes, I think that's right.
The industry.
And then there's also kind of a impetus that's like, well, we have a global seafood deficit, right? We import a lot of we're going to get this from other countries that already have aquaculture. So why don't we just do it ourselves in our own industry, in our own waters?
Thank you.
So in Maine, town after town and proposal after proposal is following in this logic laid out by a white paper called Maine Aquaculture Roadmap. And there was a lot of pushback on that roadmap, but the marine policy of our state at this time seems to be to welcome these kinds of investments. But if you see what happens on the ground is town after town, bay after bay, community after community rise up, unify across all sorts of lines and say, no way, out of our bay. And that goes for Acadia, the Acadia group, the Frenchman Bay United, that goes for Belfast. Now there's a fight in Jonesport. So when you're a lawyer and you look at the large pattern and the kind of trajectory of these struggles, where you see communities and voters, towns like Lubec and Beals voting to have supplemental regulation on these self-regulating, essentially, industry. What does that pattern language signify to you in the long arc of justice? Are we on a good roll here in Maine?
Yeah, everything I'm excited to learn more, but everything I've heard so far gives me a lot of optimism and hope that you are. It's just super inspiring, and we're here to try to potentially do whatever we can to help in that regard. But I do think Maine is special in a lot of ways. One is the local home rule power ability that local governments have. There's only a few states in the country that have that. It's very special, and it allows you to really, at a grassroots level from the bottom up, make a huge difference in what your laws are that regulate your own local environments. So yeah, I think it's a great. It seems like some great work has already been done. Very exciting, and as we've heard, globally, and my work is domestic, is national in scope though, and I'm here for a reason. I think this is ground zero in this fight. I think this is really important. It's really timely, and there's a lot of energy. You can feel it here, just being here today. So.
Augusta is trying to do away with home rule authority.
Yeah, I heard. Yeah, they know how powerful it is too.
Yeah.
So we gotta keep them from doing that. You
Not
know.
many communities in Maine know that.
Yeah.
We do here, we have an extremely experienced first selectman who's used it successfully many times.
Right. Right.
It's a big threat for that home rule authority
Yeah.
to go away.
Absolutely. Very important to try to retain it.
George, go a little bit slow motion on preemption, federal, state, local, and how that's the huge fight, right? Because the feds say, hey, we're gonna preempt states, and the states say we're gonna preempt local, and that's how you kill democracy, right? And
Yeah.
so the unusual thing here, the fight that happened in California to try and preserve democracy at the local level. Just run that down in slow motion for a minute.
Yeah. I mean, constitutionally, the way the system is set up is you know, the U.S. federal constitution and federal laws are generally supreme over state laws when there's a conflict. If there's a area where there's no federal action, you know, it's left an empty field, then states are free to enact whatever laws they want. But when both the federal and the state government enact laws in the same area, if they conflict, the federal one wins. Generally, that's preemption. And then you also have that between states and local governments. In most places, the state preempts any local efforts except special places like Maine, where you have local home rule, where it's a little different.
So home rule, home waters, right to food, enshrined in our state constitution, tribal right to fish unmolested, and also the smell that you may perceive in your nostrils is that of home-cooked food.
That's right.
Available to you for free of regulation, to give away food for free in our state, in any state. So you can freely enjoy the chowder, and then, you know, converse freely with each other. Free speech, free fish. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, everybody. Thank you for those on Zoom.